January 11, 1944, 30,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. The air was thin and cold, so cold that breath crystallized instantly inside oxygen masks, and the metal skin of the bombers radiated a chill that no amount of leather or sheepskin could ward off. Major James Howard sat alone in the cramped cockpit of his P-51 Mustang, scanning the horizon through a canopy streaked with frost. Below him, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses churned eastward through the winter sky, their contrails stretching like chalk lines across the pale European canvas. The bombers were headed deep into the Third Reich, toward the aircraft factories at Oschersleben, factories that fed the Luftwaffe's insatiable appetite for fighters. Howard's squadron had turned back miles ago, low on fuel, leaving him as the sole American fighter escort for an entire bomber group, 64 heavy bombers, 1 Mustang, and somewhere in the gray expanse ahead, the wolves were gathering. In the operations rooms beneath the frozen earth of northern Germany, Luftwaffe controllers watched the radar returns with predatory interest. This was their kind of mathematics. Overwhelming numerical superiority applied with surgical precision. The American formations were predictable, their tactics textbook, their defensive postures well documented. German fighter pilots had spent 3 years studying the American way of war, dissecting every engagement, cataloging every weakness. They knew how the bombers flew in their tight defensive boxes, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, each aircraft positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. They knew how American fighter escorts conserved fuel and ammunition, husbanding their resources, flying disciplined formations that looked magnificent in training films, but often proved inflexible in the chaos of combat. And they knew, or thought they knew, that when the Americans were outnumbered, when their careful calculations collapsed under the weight of superior numbers, they would break. They would run. They always did. The Luftwaffe pilots climbing into their Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s that morning were not novices. Many wore the Knight's Cross at their throats, marking them as aces with dozens of kills. They had fought over Spain, Poland, France, the Low Countries, Britain, Russia. They had seen American bombers fall from the sky in flames, had watched P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings turn for home when the fuel gauges dipped toward red. They expected this day to follow the familiar script, a coordinated assault carefully timed, with fighters attacking in waves from multiple angles while the lone American escort made the only rational choice and withdrew. What they encountered instead was something that defied every assumption in the Luftwaffe's tactical playbook. What they encountered was not a retreat. It was a demolition. For 3 years, the Reich's propaganda ministry had crafted an image of the Luftwaffe as the Eagle of Europe, a force of technical superiority and Teutonic discipline. German pilots were told they flew the world's finest aircraft, trained in the world's most rigorous academies, serving a cause ordained by history itself. The Americans, by contrast, were portrayed as wealthy but soft, mechanically proficient but lacking the warrior spirit forged in the crucible of European conflict. They flew in straight lines because they lacked imagination. They adhered to formations because they lacked individual skill. They relied on numbers because they lacked quality. These beliefs were not mere propaganda. They were articles of faith, reinforced by early encounters where inexperienced American pilots had indeed suffered staggering losses. But January 1944 was not January 1943. The Americans had learned, they had adapted, and they had brought with them something the Luftwaffe had not fully appreciated: an industrial capacity so vast, a logistical system so efficient, that they could afford to make mistakes, absorb losses, and return stronger each time. Major Howard had no illusions about glory that morning. He was 30 years old, a former Navy pilot who had resigned his commission years earlier to fly for the Chinese Air Force against the Japanese. He had shot down 6 enemy aircraft over China, learned to fight outnumbered, learned to make every bullet count. When war came to America, he returned and joined the Army Air Forces, bringing with him a combat veteran's understanding that survival was not about following rules. It was about making the enemy react to you. As he watched the first specks of enemy fighters appear on the horizon, climbing toward the bomber stream, he made a decision that would have earned him a court-martial from a less pragmatic commander. He ignored every tactical doctrine in the escort fighter manual. He abandoned the defensive posture. He attacked. The German formation approaching the bombers was a textbook example of Luftwaffe coordination. 3 groups of fighters stacked at different altitudes, preparing to execute simultaneous attacks from multiple vectors. It was the kind of assault that had shattered American formations before, overwhelming escorts and savaging bomber groups. The lead German pilots expected the lone P-51 to do what any sane fighter pilot would do: position himself defensively near the bombers and hope to survive. Instead, Howard dove straight into the center of the German formation at full throttle. He did not try to maintain position. He did not conserve ammunition. He became a one-man disruption, slashing through the carefully orchestrated attack, firing short bursts, forcing German pilots to break formation, turning what should have been a coordinated assault into a swirling dogfight where numerical superiority meant nothing because no one could maintain organized tactics. In the cramped gunner positions of the B-17s, men watched with disbelief as the single Mustang tore through enemy fighters like a shark through a school of fish. They saw Focke-Wulfs breaking off attacks, Messerschmitts scattering, the entire German formation losing cohesion. Howard was not fighting to shoot down every enemy aircraft. He was fighting to prevent them from shooting down bombers. Every second he kept the Germans reacting to him was a second they were not attacking the lumbering fortresses. He dove, climbed, rolled, fired, dove again, his Mustang's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine screaming as he pushed the aircraft to its limits. The Germans, conditioned by years of encountering cautious American tactics, found themselves facing something they had not prepared for: an American pilot who fought like they imagined only Germans fought, with absolute aggression and tactical abandon. The historical record would later document what happened in the skies over Oschersleben with clinical precision. Between 1330 and 1344 hours, 14 minutes, Major James Howard engaged an estimated 30 German fighters. He shot down 4 confirmed, damaged several others, and disrupted multiple coordinated attacks. Not a single bomber under his protection was lost to fighter attack during that engagement. When he finally broke off, his ammunition exhausted, his fuel gauge hovering near empty, the German formation had been scattered across 50 miles of sky. Luftwaffe after-action reports described the engagement with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect, noting that a single American fighter had achieved what should have been tactically impossible. But the reports missed the deeper significance. What Howard had demonstrated was not individual heroism. It was the emergence of a new American way of war, one that combined industrial abundance with tactical innovation in ways the Luftwaffe's rigid doctrines could not counter. The bombers continued to Oschersleben, dropped their payloads on the aircraft factories, and turned for home. Howard's Mustang limped back to England, its engine coughing, its guns empty, its fuselage stitched with holes from German cannon fire. When he climbed out of the cockpit, he was so exhausted he could barely stand. His squadron mates, who had landed earlier, gathered around him as he described the engagement in terse, matter-of-fact sentences. No one quite believed him until the bomber crews returned and confirmed every detail. The gunners had seen it all. They had watched one American fighter do what an entire squadron was supposed to do. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was drafted that evening. But to understand why this 14-minute engagement became a turning point in the air war over Europe, you have to understand what it represented beyond the individual heroics. You have to understand the collision of 2 fundamentally different military philosophies. 2 different ways of conceiving air combat, 2 different visions of what industrial warfare meant in the 20th century. The Luftwaffe in 1944 was an air force built on scarcity. Every gallon of fuel was precious, refined from Romanian oil fields under constant threat of Allied bombing. Every aircraft was a carefully managed resource, produced in factories that operated under increasingly difficult conditions. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to fight efficiently, to maximize the kill-to-loss ratio, to conserve resources because there were no vast reserves waiting in the rear. They flew with an accountant's mentality, calculating the mathematics of attrition, avoiding unnecessary risks. This had served them well in the early years of the war, when they faced opponents even more resource-constrained than themselves. The Americans came from a different universe. By January 1944, the United States was producing more combat aircraft in a single month than Germany produced in 6. American factories operated around the clock, fed by supply chains that stretched across an entire continent, untouched by bombing. American pilots trained on surplus aircraft, burned surplus fuel, fired surplus ammunition. When an American fighter group suffered 50% losses, it was reconstituted with fresh aircraft and fresh pilots within weeks. The Luftwaffe's careful calculations meant nothing against an opponent who could afford to be prodigal, who could trade losses at rates that would bankrupt any other military and emerge stronger. But sheer numbers were not enough. The early American bomber offensive had proven that, with horrific loss rates that nearly forced a suspension of daylight bombing. What changed the equation was the marriage of abundance with innovation, quantity with quality. The P-51 Mustang that Howard flew was not just numerous. It was superior, with longer range than any previous escort fighter, speed that matched or exceeded its opponents, and handling characteristics that gave skilled pilots a decisive edge. The Luftwaffe pilots climbing away from Oschersleben that day, those who survived, carried back reports that troubled their commanders. They described an American pilot who fought with a ferocity and skill that contradicted years of assumptions. They described a fighter that seemed to have limitless ammunition, bottomless fuel tanks, performance margins that allowed it to engage and disengage at will. These reports were filed, analyzed, and filed again. The Luftwaffe's tactical theorists updated their assessments, adjusted their doctrines, drafted new countermeasures. But the underlying problem was not tactical. It was existential. The Americans could afford to produce pilots like Howard because they had the luxury of finding the best natural fighters in a population of 130 million people, training them lavishly, equipping them with the finest aircraft that unlimited industrial capacity could produce, and sending them into combat with the understanding that losses, however painful, were sustainable. The Luftwaffe was bleeding its experienced pilots dry, replacing them with hastily trained teenagers who often died on their first missions, facing an enemy that grew stronger with each passing month. There was a saying among German fighter pilots, in the last years of the war, "The Americans fly to a timetable." It was meant as a criticism, an observation that American operations were predictable, mechanical, lacking the improvisational flair of the Luftwaffe's veteran pilots. But it missed the point. The Americans flew to a timetable because they had the logistical depth to plan operations months in advance, confident that the fuel would be available, the aircraft would be ready, the replacement pilots would arrive on schedule. The Luftwaffe flew hand-to-mouth, scrambling to concentrate forces, rationing fuel, cannibalizing damaged aircraft for spare parts. Predictability was a luxury afforded by abundance. The Germans, who had built their military traditions around the cult of individual excellence, around the ace who single-handedly changed the course of battles, found themselves facing an opponent who had industrialized excellence, who produced competent pilots by the thousands and exceptional pilots by the hundreds. In the years before the war, American military aviation had been almost an afterthought. The Air Corps was small, underfunded, equipped with obsolescent aircraft. When war came to Europe in 1939, the United States had fewer than 2,000 military aircraft, most of them trainers. The Luftwaffe had more than 4,000 frontline combat aircraft, flown by pilots who had trained in secret since the early 1930s. German aviation seemed to represent the future, sleek, modern, victorious. American aviation seemed quaint, a hobby for barnstormers and airmail pilots. But appearances deceived. What America lacked in military tradition, it possessed in industrial capacity and engineering culture. American aircraft designers were not constrained by military specifications written decades earlier. They were free to innovate, to experiment, to take the best ideas from wherever they found them. British superchargers, German aerodynamics, lessons learned from racing planes and commercial transports. The P-51 Mustang itself was a hybrid creation, designed by North American Aviation to British specifications, powered by a British engine, incorporating aerodynamic refinements from multiple sources. It was not the product of Teutonic engineering, discipline. It was the product of pragmatic American improvisation operating at industrial scale. When Major Howard landed at Steeple Morden that January afternoon, He became the living embodiment of something the Luftwaffe had failed to prepare for, the American capacity to produce not just aircraft and pilots, but combat effectiveness at a rate that overwhelmed traditional calculations. The Germans had assumed that fighting quality was a finite resource, carefully cultivated over years, impossible to mass produce. They were wrong. The Americans had figured out how to take farm boys and factory workers, put them through intensive training programs, give them overwhelming material advantages, and turn them into effective combat pilots in months rather than years. Not all of them were aces. Most were merely competent. But competence, when multiplied by thousands and supported by unlimited logistics, defeated excellence starved of resources. There was a moment, recorded in German gun camera footage from a different engagement weeks later, that captured the changing nature of the air war. A formation of P-51s is intercepted by Luftwaffe fighters. The Germans execute a perfect bounce, diving from above, using the sun to mask their approach. It is the kind of attack that would have scattered American formations a year earlier. But the P-51s do not scatter. They do not panic. They execute a coordinated defensive turn, maintaining formation integrity, their wingmen covering each other with disciplined precision. The German attack, though perfectly executed, achieves nothing. The formations pass through each other, a few bursts of gunfire exchanged, and then the Americans are climbing away, still in formation, heading to their target. The German pilots, low on fuel from the climb and the attack, turn for home without pressing the engagement. In the debriefing, the German flight leader notes with frustration, "They fly like machines. You cannot rattle them." He meant it as an insult. He did not understand that it was a compliment, an acknowledgement that the Americans had systematized combat effectiveness in ways that transcended individual skill. The bomber crews who witnessed Howard's lone stand over Oschersleben returned to their bases and told the story in mess halls and barracks across England. The story grew with each retelling, taking on mythic dimensions until it became a parable about American fighting spirit. But the real lesson was more subtle and more profound. What Howard had done was demonstrate that American doctrine, often derided as inflexible and unimaginative, could produce outcomes that rivaled or exceeded anything the vaunted Luftwaffe aces achieved, not through individual brilliance alone, but through the marriage of competence, aggression, and material superiority. Howard was an exceptional pilot, no question, but he flew an exceptional aircraft, fueled by unlimited gasoline, armed with abundant ammunition, supported by a logistical system that had delivered him to that moment with every possible advantage. His victory was not an individual achievement divorced from context. It was the product of an entire system designed to generate and sustain combat power. In the months following Oschersleben, the Luftwaffe's situation deteriorated with accelerating speed. The oil refineries in Romania came under sustained attack. The aircraft factories inside Germany were bombed repeatedly, forcing dispersion into underground facilities that reduced production rates. Pilot training programs were shortened, fuel allocations reduced, operational readiness rates plummeted. By summer 1944, when the Allies invaded Normandy, the Luftwaffe could barely contest the skies over France. The fighter groups that had once terrorized Allied bombers were reduced to flying sporadic defensive patrols, husbanding fuel, avoiding combat unless conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. The Americans, meanwhile, grew stronger. New fighter groups arrived from the United States every month. P-51 production reached levels that seemed almost absurd. Thousands of aircraft rolling off assembly lines, more than could possibly be lost in combat. Replacement pilots arrived with better training than their predecessors, flying aircraft equipped with the latest improvements. The mathematical inevitability of the situation was clear to anyone who studied the numbers, but numbers alone do not convey the psychological impact. German fighter pilots in the last year of the war described a peculiar form of despair that came from facing an enemy who simply could not be depleted. You could shoot down American aircraft all day, rack up impressive kill counts, return to base with gun camera footage proving your victories, and the next day there would be more Americans in the sky, just as many as before, flying the same confident formations, pressing the same relentless offensive. It was like fighting the ocean. Every wave you broke was replaced by another and another and another endlessly. The Luftwaffe's aces, those who survived, found their achievements rendered meaningless by the sheer scale of the opposition. To shoot down 5 American aircraft in a single day was a feat worthy of decoration, but it changed nothing, accomplished nothing, because tomorrow those 5 aircraft would be replaced and the attrition would continue. The Americans could afford to lose. The Germans could not, and everyone knew it. There was a symbolic dimension to the air war that transcended tactical considerations, a dimension that both sides understood but rarely articulated. Every contrail over Germany was a visible demonstration that the Reich's borders were permeable, that German airspace was not sovereign, that the Luftwaffe could not protect the homeland. German civilians looked up and saw formations of bombers passing overhead in daylight, untouchable, methodical, indifferent to the flak bursting around them. They saw the contrails of escort fighters, American fighters, deep over German territory, flying with the confidence of aircraft operating in friendly skies. The psychological impact was devastating. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy in part on the promise of protection, the assurance that German strength and German technology would shield the folk from the horrors of war. The sight of American bombers over Berlin in broad daylight shattered that promise more effectively than any propaganda broadcast. For the Americans, the air offensive was not merely a military operation. It was a demonstration of industrial democracy's capacity to project power. Every bomber formation was a flying assembly line, a mobile factory of destruction, crewed by men who had been civilians months earlier and would return to civilian life when the war ended. They were not a warrior caste. They were ordinary people, organized and equipped by a system that turned democratic industrialism into military force. The Luftwaffe's aces, with their Knight's Crosses and 100-kill tallies, represented the old European ideal of martial excellence, the skilled individual warrior whose prowess set him apart from common men. The American bomber crews, with their rotating tours and point systems and focus on completing 25 missions so they could go home, represented something new, the citizen soldier, effective not because of individual excellence but because of systemic competence. The contrast was not lost on observers on either side. When Major Howard received the Medal of Honor from General Eisenhower in a ceremony months later, the citation praised his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. The language was formulaic, the same phrases used in countless other citations, but the witnesses to the ceremony understood that they were watching something more than the recognition of individual heroism. They were watching the symbolic elevation of a new kind of American warrior, one who combined frontier individualism with industrial discipline, who could operate alone if necessary, but preferred to operate as part of a system, who measured success not in personal glory but in mission accomplishment. Howard himself was uncomfortable with the attention, deflecting credit to the aircraft he flew, the maintainers who kept it flying, the training he had received. He understood intuitively what the ceremony represented, not the triumph of an individual, but the triumph of a system that could produce individuals capable of such feats and provide them with the tools to succeed. The Luftwaffe never developed an effective counter to the American system. They tried technological solutions, jet aircraft, rocket interceptors, heavy cannon that could destroy bombers with a single hit. Some of these innovations were formidable, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. They tried tactical innovations, massed formations of fighters attacking in overwhelming strength, ramming attacks by desperate pilots, night fighter tactics adapted to daylight operations. None of it sufficed. The fundamental problem was not tactical or technical, it was strategic and economic. The Americans had more of everything, and they were learning to use what they had more effectively with each passing month. The Luftwaffe was trapped in a war of attrition that they could not win, fighting an opponent who could absorb losses they could not afford, and who grew stronger from the exchange. There is a photograph, taken in the spring of 1945, that captures the end state of the air war. It shows a German Autobahn being used as an emergency airstrip. Dozens of Luftwaffe fighters are scattered along the roadway, hidden under camouflage netting, refueled from trucks because the underground fuel depots have been bombed into rubble. The pilots, many of them teenagers, sit on the ground near their aircraft waiting for orders that rarely come because centralized control has broken down and the communications network is shattered. In the sky above, contrails crisscross the blue spring sky, American bombers and fighters, flying to targets deep in what remains of the Reich, unopposed because the Luftwaffe can no longer mount effective resistance. The photograph is not dramatic. There is no combat, no fire, no destruction visible, but it tells the story of the air war's conclusion more clearly than any combat footage. German fighters on the ground, hidden, immobile, while American aircraft own the sky. The lessons of Oschersleben and the air war over Europe rippled far beyond the immediate military context. They represented a preview of how industrial democracies would wage war in the second half of the 20th century, not through the cult of individual warriors, but through the systematic application of technological and industrial superiority, organized by competent institutions, executed by trained professionals who were citizens first and soldiers second. The American way of war that emerged from World War II was not particularly elegant. It did not produce many warrior poets or philosopher generals. It was blunt, material overwhelming, but it was also adaptable, innovative when necessary, and ultimately effective. The Luftwaffe represented the zenith of interwar European military professionalism, and it was systematically dismantled by an opponent that valued different things: production capacity over individual quality, systematic effectiveness over brilliant improvisation, sustainable attrition over decisive brilliance. Major Howard returned to the United States after his combat tour and lived a quiet life, uncomfortable with celebrity, resistant to efforts to turn him into a propaganda symbol. He had done his job, flown his missions, and wanted to return to normalcy. In this, too, he was representative of a particular American archetype: the citizen soldier who performs extraordinary feats when called upon, and then fades back into civilian life without seeking permanent glory. The Luftwaffe's aces, by contrast, often found themselves trapped by their own legends, unable to escape the identity that the war had imposed on them. The contrast reflected deeper differences in how the two societies conceived of military service and martial virtue. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow force, its best pilots dead, its aircraft grounded for lack of fuel, its infrastructure destroyed. The American Air Forces, conversely, were at the peak of their power. Thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of trained pilots, a logistical apparatus that spanned the globe. The immediate post-war period saw rapid demobilization, with most of that force evaporating within months as citizen soldiers returned to civilian life. But the institutional knowledge remained, the industrial capacity remained, the understanding of how to generate and project air power remained. When new conflicts emerged, the system could be reactivated, scaled up, adapted to new challenges. This was the ultimate lesson of the air war, that sustainable military power in the industrial age flowed not from warrior traditions or individual excellence, but from the capacity to organize industrial democracies for sustained conflict. In the decades since, military historians have analyzed the air war over Europe from every conceivable angle: tactical, operational, strategic, technological, economic. The consensus that has emerged is that the outcome was overdetermined, that German defeat was inevitable once the United States entered the war and brought its industrial capacity to bear. But inevitability in retrospect can obscure the human reality of the struggle. For the men who fought in the air over Europe, the outcome was not inevitable. Every mission was a roll of the dice, every engagement a test of skill and luck and machinery. The German pilots who climbed into their Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts knew they were fighting a losing battle, but they flew anyway, driven by duty or fear or inertia. The American pilots who escorted bomber streams deep into Germany understood that they held the advantage, but they also understood that advantage did not guarantee survival, that every mission carried risks, that the statistics could claim you as easily as anyone else. What happened over Oschersleben on January 11, 1944, was not the turning point of the air war. That had already occurred months earlier, when the P-51s began arriving in numbers and the Luftwaffe's loss rates became unsustainable. But it was a crystallization of what the turning point meant, a moment when all the underlying trends and advantages manifested in a single engagement. One American pilot flying one American aircraft achieved what should have been impossible because behind him, stood an entire system designed to make the impossible routine. The Luftwaffe pilots who limped back to their bases that day had encountered not just a skilled opponent, but a preview of their own obsolescence, a demonstration that the kind of air warfare they had mastered was being superseded by something they had not prepared for and could not counter. In the end, the stupid formation that the Germans had mocked, the disciplined box formations of American bombers, the methodical escort patterns, the reliance on systematic coordination over individual initiative, proved to be anything but stupid. It was the application of industrial logic to warfare, the recognition that in a conflict of scale, systematic effectiveness trumped individual brilliance. The Luftwaffe's aces shot down more enemy aircraft per pilot than their American counterparts. But the Americans won the air war because they understood that victory went not to the side with the highest individual scores, but to the side that could sustain operations, absorb losses, and maintain pressure until the enemy collapsed. The sky over Germany in early 1945 was American sky, filled with American aircraft flown by American pilots who had learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable. The Luftwaffe, which had begun the war as the most formidable air force in the world, ended it grounded and irrelevant, a force that existed on paper but could no longer influence events. The transformation had taken less than 4 years. In military terms, it was a remarkably rapid collapse, but the collapse was not the result of any single battle or brilliant strategy. It was the cumulative result of 1,000 small victories, 1,000 decisions that traded immediate losses for long-term advantage, 1,000 demonstrations that American industrial democracy, for all its apparent inefficiencies and contradictions, could mobilize and sustain military power on a scale that no other system could match. Major James Howard's 14 minutes over Oschersleben became a legend, retold in books and articles and documentaries. But the deeper truth that the engagement revealed was less dramatic and more important, that in modern industrial warfare, there is no substitute for depth of resources, depth of training, depth of industrial capacity, depth of national will. The Luftwaffe had skill and tradition and the desperate ferocity of men fighting for their homeland's survival. The Americans had depth, and in the end, depth prevailed. The Mustangs kept coming, the bombers kept flying. The escorts kept protecting them, until there was nothing left to fight for and nowhere left to hide. 70 years later, the sky over Oschersleben is peaceful, traced occasionally by commercial contrails but empty of warplanes. The factories that once built Focke-Wulfs are gone, the airfields overgrown, the scars of war softened by time. But the lesson remains written in the historical record for those who care to read it, that abundance, when coupled with competence and will, defeats excellence starved of resources. That systematic effectiveness, however unglamorous, prevails over brilliant improvisation. That democracies at war, for all their apparent chaos and inefficiency, can mobilize and sustain power in ways that more regimented systems cannot match. Major Howard's lonely battle was not an aberration. It was a symbol, a 14-minute demonstration of what American industrial democracy could produce when necessity called. And what it could produce, it produced by the thousands, until the skies over Europe belonged to men who had been farmers and mechanics and college students, who flew not for glory or ideology but because it was their job, and who returned home when the job was done to build the world that their victory had made possible.